Welcome to the first content video for Psych 230 Lifespan Development. Now, this does not mirror the text exactly. It has a lot of the same information and spells out things, and it has some added information, but it is not. It does not follow exactly along with your text. There will be a separate voiceover regarding research and systems theory. Before we get into lifespan development or the developmental psychology, I want to review a few areas in psychology per se, just to make sure that we all have the same basis. Okay, so here's some more definitions of psychology. So we're looking at the scientific study of behavior, the study of the mind, and that includes the mental, the emotional, and what's not often mentioned is the spiritual. So one of the things that you may not have thought about before is the difference in brain and mind, or brain versus mind. We know what the brain is. It's an organ in the body. We know where it is. It's in our skull. What's the mind? Where do we find the mind? Certainly you can't find it on autopsy. Now, I could get into a long philosophical discussion about it, but in this course, let's just talk about the brain and the mind are separate. There's this concept of duality, like the yin and yang side on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint. So you have the brain and the mind are separate, but they work very closely with each other. Some things the brain does on its own. Many other things are influenced by the mind. For students in my class, you need to think that the mind thinks the thought. Okay, the brain doesn't think the thought. That's a whole nother discussion. We'll get into it deeper, but just go with that attitude right now, or that concept. So just briefly, it's been touched on before. Psychology kind of began with the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle back to 500 years BC. And understand that philosophy began in religion. For lack of a better term, the original religion would be referred to as paganism, because they had different gods for many things. The first religion, although they would say it's more a way of life, but they do refer to gods, as Hinduism. Started a long time before Judaism, and then Buddhism came along as kind of like the Protestant Reformation for Christianity. Buddhism kind of reformed or took a different tack than Hinduism. Then we had Christianity, began with Christ and his death, and then Islam 600 years later. So those are the three main, the three Abrahamic religions are the ones we're most familiar with. So when we look at the goals of psychology, it comes out of the ancient goals were, why am I here? That comes out of that philosophical background. In the early 20th century, the 1900s, as they began to study psychology as a science, then we got into looking at genius, but the thing that really took off was how can we predict and control people? And the first person to really take advantage of this was Adolf Hitler. So through propaganda and so forth, he tried to take over the world. The current goal, in most cases, is mental health. and that's trying to bring the mentally ill or the abnormal back to normal. The future goal is more of positive psychology, which is my main interest, and that's to help normal people achieve their potential or self-actualize. So how can we take normal people, you, me, and make us better? So there's a couple of enduring issues. There are, in psychology, the diversity versus universality. How are people similar to others? How are they different and unique? So we look at it and we say our personalities are different, but if you look at the DNA of people, we're 98 to 99% the same. Okay. Another enduring issue is nature versus nurture. Is our behavior determined by our heredity, or is it determined by our environment? And I'll shortcut to my views on that are yes, it's both. And the same thing I mentioned earlier about mind and body. There is a relationship between the mind and the body. So you've already heard about some of the schools of psychology. I'm not going to go into them. The dates for you guys are not important. I don't want you to remember that Jung came up with his theory of personality in 1907 after Freud's 1900 theory. The important thing to look at that is how spread out they are, okay, and how they overlapped. So while in textbooks you learn about structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic theory, behavioral theory, Gestalt, cognitive, humanistic, etc., you learn those in kind of silos, and you get the idea that they happened one after the other after the other. The fact is they've all been going on at the same time. Some of them were the response of other things. So functionalism was a response to structuralism. James disagreed with Wundt. Okay, now both of those things have been absorbed into the other theories. So the three main ones that we look at now are psychoanalytic theory, behaviorism, and cognitive theory. Gestalt gets mixed in with everything, as does humanistic theory, transpersonal. And then human science is the more modern real name for psychology, which looks at all of these things together. But the ones you're going to be focusing on for this course are psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory, behaviorism, and cognitive theory. So what underlies all the models in all of the different things, all the different schools of thought, is Freud's model of personality. And we often use an iceberg to represent that because you have the conscious, which is on top of the water, which is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay? And then under that, you have the unconscious. Making up those things, you have the id, which is totally in the unconscious, the ego, which is up and down, and the superego. And we'll talk about those more in detail as the course goes on. But understand that Freud's whole concept was that everything we did was in response to fears, aggression, libido, which is sex, and fixations. All of those things were in the unconscious, and they tried to bubble out through the conscious, and it's the ego's job to keep them in check. The superego is kind of like the good angel on your shoulder. The id is the devil on your shoulder. So all those fears, aggression, libido, and fixations are what is referred to as drives or instincts. So these are woven into our vernacular. They're woven into the way we talk, things we do. Certain things are accepted, but we may not really think about what they're actually saying. So you need to become aware of that as this goes along. So when we look for developmental psychology specifically, what we're doing is we're trying to figure out what shapes the way we change over time. What are the influences on that, on our development? Biology, environment, social, cultural, behavior, all of these things influence it. And all the different areas of psychology can be looked at from this perspective. And we are endless. As we look at developmental psychology, we have to look at the science of development, and you can't have science without a good theory. So the science is the constancy or the change or plasticity throughout the lifespan. Uh, Developmental psych is scientific. It is absolutely applied, and it's very interdisciplinary. Okay, what we're trying to do, as with all psychology really, is describe behavior, explain behavior, and predict behavior. So the next slide covers three basic issues in developmental psychology. We'll get into each of those deeper as we go along, and be aware that they are going to keep coming up and coming up throughout this course. So you need to be aware of these three issues. So in developmental psychology, there's some basic issues. The first is development continuous or discontinuous? In other words, does it happen on an even arc, or does it come in stages? So anytime you say, oh, they're just going through a stage, then they're talking about discontinuous issues or discontinuous concepts in developmental psychology. There's also the concept of it being multidimensional. We don't just learn in one area at one time. We have emotional, which is also social relevance. There's cognitive, our thinking ability, our physical ability. All of these things influence each other and happen at similar times or different times for different people, but they all influence each other and are interlocked. So the next issue is nature versus nurture, or nature and nurture. Nature is heredity, biology. Nurture is the environment. The next slide will have a video that goes into those in more depth. The final basic issue is stability versus plasticity, or change. Do we stay the same, or are we able to change? You've often heard that a leopard can't change its spots, but we do see people change over time. I think, one of the things that I study often is addictions, and if people couldn't change, nobody would be getting over addictions. The next video gives you a little further explanation. So thinking about those three issues, we look at the lifespan perspective, and we look at development as being lifelong, multi-dimensional, multi-directional, highly plastic, and influenced by numerous interacting forces. So the next thing that we look at are the different perspectives by the different schools that we mentioned earlier. So when you look at the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theories, Freud came up with 5 psychosexual stages. Notice Freud is always about sex and fear and anger. But he stopped at adolescence. He felt that people didn't grow after that. Erikson, who is a psychoanalytic person, came up with different names for the stages of development and added the social construct to that. You're going to get inundated with these stages throughout the book, so this is just an overview right now. After that, we have behaviorism and the social learning theory. I'm going to put those two together now. They'll get separated as we move forward. But behaviorism basically is conditioning, and we all get conditioned. I often refer to the behaviorists as rat runners. They're the ones who run rats through the mazes. Some of you in the psych program are going to be doing that. And those of you who are not, just think of the next time you go to the grocery store, what kind of maze you're going through. And then social learning theory comes from Bandura and Vygotsky. Modeling, monkey see, monkey do, if you want to call it that, and learning from watching other people. And then you have cognitive development, our abilities to think and our intelligence. Piaget will be the first big name that you get with that. So another name you'll hear when we get into studying how we learn and so forth is Vygotsky. He has these referred to as the socio-cultural theory, and it's a lot about the environment. He talks a lot about scaffolding, how we teach younger people to do it. Think of the guy leaning over, helping the toddler to walk, or putting training wheels on a bike. The further we get into cognitive psychology and development, then we'll be talking about information processing, as the mind is a symbol manipulating system. We think in symbols, we think in pictures. Okay, researchers develop flowcharts to map problem-solving steps. We do that in our heads. Okay, and it is a continuous process as opposed to stages. And relatively new to this developmental studies is developmental neuroscience, and they've started looking more and more at children's, infants, toddlers' brains, brain waves, and what and when and how certain parts of the brain develop. Now, on top of that, there are different perspectives. We have the biological perspective, which is looking at the genes, brain, nervous system, endocrine system, and so forth. And that's biology. Okay. You have the evolutionary perspective, and that's really looking at how we adapt to things, and that gets into it. It spans nature and nurture. And then there's the cultural perspective, which is looking at all the diversity, how different cultures think certain things are important or not important, and the consequences of behavior. So, for example, Japanese women cover their mouth when they smile or laugh because in the Japanese culture, it's rude to have your mouth open and showing your teeth. Okay, we think that's strange, but they don't. Okay, now these perspectives go through all the different schools that we were talking about before, all the different theories, psychodynamic, cognitive, behavioral, humanistic, and so forth. All of these perspectives exist. Along the lines, when we look at the biology, there's a field that's becoming more and more popular and well known called epigenetics. And what epigenetics says is that our environment can cause our genes to mutate and change. So stuff that we actually do or take into our bodies, whether on purpose or by accident, can change us. The best example I can give you is that long ago in the 1970s, there was an area along the Erie Canal called the Love Canal up in northern New York. And because the Erie Canal itself was no longer functional, the Love Canal, that section of it near Love, New York, became totally toxic and couldn't, it was hazardous to everyone's health. So it was so bad that they had to get everybody out of town and relocate them. So this whole small town was relocated all across the country. A lot of them went to relatives in different places and so forth. Because and what ticked them off was the cancer levels in the people there. All sorts of dire cancer situations were involved. And what happened was that the two generations following the Love Canal have also shown a tendency towards cancer. So the hazardous materials cause the genes in the primary generation to change and become cancerous. That was handed down to the next two generations. They still have a higher rate of cancer than ordinary people. The next slide has a video that helps explain epigenetics more. This is a complex concept, and you need to be able to understand it. So in addition to to epigenetics, we have a concept called neuroplasticity, and that's the ability of the brain to rewire itself. They refer to that as plasticity. It's malleable, it's moldable. So when you get into more of positive psychology and so forth, we talk about how your brain can change your mind. So for example, if you drink caffeine, it speeds you up, and that affects how you think and so forth. Your mind can change your brain, so that's how we learn. Now, the interesting thing about neuroplasticity is that it doesn't stop with age. We used to think that at a certain point in time, old dogs couldn't learn new tricks. I'm sure you've heard that somewhere along the line. That old people don't have neurons growing, but they've found out in the last 8 to 10 years that everybody keeps producing new neurons in the brain that can learn and can change. So keep that in mind. Neuroplasticity. The cultural perspective, in developmental psychology in particular, we try to look at the cross-cultural differences and the causes, and how they affect causes and behavior. Two different cultures. Part of that is also concepts or constructs like race versus ethnicity. That gets into social psychology and how people are profiled or thought about because of their race or their ethnicity. There is a difference between race and ethnicity, although some people are now saying that race is totally a psychological concept and does not have any basis in fact. It's just a matter of skin color. There's also sex versus gender. You get into gender issues. There's a difference between sex, that's the biology, and gender. Do you identify as male or female? So all of these things come in to developmental psychology, the cultural perspectives. We'll look at that more. The point of this is to tell you that there's no one perspective that answers all the questions. There's no one school of thought that answers all the questions. Everything impacts itself. You have to take a little from here, a little from there, and recognize that the psychodynamic model is the basis for all the personality theories. And all of the schools of psychology have a personality theory except for cognitive, which takes in, it kind of blends in with all of them. Keep in mind that culture is both nature and nurture. And how much does it impact our development? How much does it impact how we think about people, how we stereotype people? And believe me, we do stereotype people. We'll get into that later. If you want to learn more about that later in life, take a social psychology course. But we immediately categorize people. So the next few slides are relatively humorous, but I want you to think about why they make you smile, make you get grossed out, whatever. So, only in China, only in Hawaii, only in India, only in Thailand. You gotta bathe your snake. Only in Mexico. And definitely only in Texas. America. Take an escalator to go work out. So that wraps up this voiceover PowerPoint. Next, you should be watching the voiceover for research methods and systems. Okay, and remember, it's all a system.